Hello, BookTube, from both of us. Every once in a while, even in the heat, Frida gets up on the top of the couch. I've put a full-length pillow in front of that window just, until further notice. It's going to be a couple more days before this little heat wave moves off, and it cools off the room when that window is blocked. I don't have a drape for it. I'm not a big believer in drapes. But anyway, it's Tuesday. It's Tag Tuesday, and I have a few tags that I need to get to. In fact, I have a little backlog. You might as well call me Britta. I've got a little backlog of tags to do, and yet the one that I want to do today is one that I was just recently tagged in, so it's not part of the backlog. It was just too interesting to leave out, especially since I have a feeling there was a bit of goading involved in tagging me at all. It's the literary fiction book tag, which was created by Jasmine, and I was tagged by Alex at whatpageareyouon, and I'm not quite sure why he tagged me. Maybe spirit of fraternal joshing, but it's all about so-called literary fiction, and that is bound to provoke a rant or two. It's just bound to. But we'll start and we'll see if we can get through it without any rants, just with a literary discussion. Unfortunately, the chances of that happening are narrowed significantly by the first question, which is, how do you define literary fiction? I have watched other people do this tag, and I have seen their definitions, mostly involving contemporary literature that stresses the beauty or complexity of language over plot and structure. And I jotted down some notes for my own definition of literary fiction. It is a novel dealing either with upper middle class Connecticut divorce or the American immigrant experience, particularly the Nigerian immigrant experience, and particularly a couple of different cities and villages in Nigeria immigrant experience. It is a book that has been written sometime in the last 4 years by an author who is no older than 45 and who is under no circumstances whatsoever a heterosexual man. And if the book deals with upper middle class Connecticut divorce, then in every interview the author will talk about hardship, even though she has had unimpeded access to her parents' platinum card since she was 4 years old. And if it's a book about the Nigerian immigrant experience, then the author will spend all day not writing, but on Twitter, calling her benefactors racist. And in both cases, the novel will be extremely deficient in matters of plot, structure, believable characters, and consequences. In other words, a through flow of event A to event B. And in all cases, the end result will be used by the world's most cloistered readers to feel not only unapologetic about only reading the smallest tiny sliver of one genre, of one kind of literature, but also feeling snooty and superior about it. And if you think, well, most of my friends only read what we call literary fiction, and they're not snooty or superior about it, then wait until they gather at a party, go, and when the inevitable question comes up, what have you been reading, tell them that you just finished a Louis L'Amour novel and it was really good, and watch what happens. I will apologize ahead of time for the harsh learning experience that you will experience about people you thought you knew. But believe me, when it comes to contemporary literary fiction, its foremost adherents, its foremost devotees, are the most blinkered and sheltered and inexperienced readers anywhere in the world. Imagine, just take a step back and imagine how limited a reader you are, how crippled a reader you are. If you read only books written by people who are under 45 and who are female or trans, and who aren't writing about genre, who aren't writing nonfiction or any kind of plot. Imagine how strictured that is. That is about 15 books a year at maximum. In the American and United Kingdom publishing industry that publishes 1 million books a year. That is by far the most cloistered and self-hobbled reading ambit of any section of the reading world. And yet they are invariably, the people who hobble their reading experiences, that tiny little spectrum are invariably the ones who are most prone to condescension towards all other readers. So, and you can see it. You can see it often. Sometimes readers of this tiny, tiny little sliver of the literary world, the smallest possible sliver of the literary world. The author has to be still alive. The author cannot be a cis white man. The author has to be active on social media. The author has to be an ingrate. The author has to write about their life experience virtually mimeographically. Imagine how that limits what you read. And sometimes the adherents of so-called literary fiction who feel a little bit guilty about that, maybe they want to extend the olive branch to all the great unwashed readers out there who don't read their latest, a Nigerian immigrant novel that drops off in the middle of mid-sentence at the end because the author got tired or bored or ran out of grant money. Sometimes those devotees, the more broad-minded, if you can call any of these people broad-minded, sometimes they will say, well, I really do feel bad about not reading, genre fiction, and I would be happy to, except I have a hard time even telling what's an exemplary example, because, come on, we don't have all the time in the world, reading-wise. If I'm going to, they don't say it this way, but they mean, if I'm going to wade into the mud of mystery fiction, can you at least give me something that's halfway good? I'd like the very best mystery, maybe, perhaps, Jeeves, you could go into the pantry and bring back into the living room the very best murder mystery. What's the best murder mystery that the simple folk are reading? I'll try that, but I don't have time for anything else because really my reading time is so strict. We have almost no reading time. As you read an utterly derivative latest thin novel about upper middle class Connecticut divorce, sometimes some devotees will say that, but they don't mean it. They have sliced out a hair-thin little fracture of the Republic of Letters, and that is where they feel comfortable. And that would be fine. I wouldn't actually have much criticism of that. I would feel sorry for those people, of course, but I wouldn't have much criticism of it, much less the scorn that you may be detecting in my voice, if they didn't then turn around and condescend on everybody else. But they do. Instead of saying, yeah, like, for instance, I used to know a diehard reader who, in his professional life, he did all sorts of professional-related reading. But in his personal life, he did only one kind of reading. That's all he did. He read disposable murder mysteries. And he would literally dispose of them. He would just toss them off the boat or off the side of the bed. And a year would go by, the stereotypical thing with genre readers, a year would go by, he would pick up one that he'd already read, and he wouldn't realize that he'd already read it until he was halfway through it. And he loved it, and I had no problem with that whatsoever. And when you talked to him about it, the first thing he would do was get a little bashful and maybe offer a quasi-apology. Yes, I know, I'm a grown man, but I love these things. I really don't have... I have very limited reading time for non-professional stuff, and I like to fill it with the stuff I love. I know I should be reading, the latest serious fiction or the latest work of popular philosophy, but this is what I like. Offered with a good-natured apology. And of course, it's not a groveling apology. None of us should apologize for our reading, but it was meant mainly as a doff of the hat to the fact that, look, I know that my free time personal reading is extremely narrow. I know that, and I'm not trying to defend that. That's fine, and the days of that are over. They're absolutely gone. In the 21st century especially, young readers especially, under the age of 30 especially, in other words, the all-knowing among us, absolutely refuse to do that. In fact, they do the inverse. If you point out, that they only read slim, wanly written novels about upper-middle-class Connecticut divorce or the Nigerian immigrant experience written by authors who are under 45 and are heavily prominent on social media, and you maybe indicate in your description that maybe that's a little narrow in terms of reading, their response is not what my old friend's response was. Instead, it's the exact opposite. That's the only thing worth reading. And they absolutely don't know that. They are less able to know that than any other reader in the world, including school children. These are people who absolutely will not read a book by an old author. They absolutely will not read a book by an old author who's recently died. They absolutely will not read a book by an author who's been dead for decades. They absolutely will not read a book from the canon, and they absolutely under no circumstances will read a book older than 100 years, much less older than 2,000 years. In other words, they don't know anything at all about the literary antecedents of what they slop up every day. And yet, where is the humility or even the perspective? Nowhere to be found. Nowhere. You will never find anyone higher on their horse as a reader than a reader exclusively of what we call contemporary literary fiction who reads nothing else. You will never find anyone more condescending than that. Anyway, that's how I define literary fiction. It's not an easy, quick description because it's a little bit long. But let's just move on. I guess the goal of doing this without ranting has gone right out the window, just like Frida's gone right out the window. Question number 2. We're only at 2. All right. Name a literary fiction novel. Hereafter, we will call that LFN because that phrase is repeated identically in every question. Name a literary fiction novel with a brilliant character study. And I wish I could. Unfortunately, the ones that have even halfway good character studies peter out. Because the authors don't have any sense at all of structure or arc or inner dramatics, and they also lose interest in what they're writing about. So a hallmark of contemporary literary fiction is that it does not end, it just stops. Sometimes in mid-sentence, but always in mid-thought, always in mid-development. You will never get to unless you're a brainwashed member of the Brooklyn Squad, if all you read is contemporary literary fiction and you literally never read anything else, then you're not going to call it on this because probably you've warped your mind to the point where you're not going to realize it. But if you read anything else, especially if you read anything plot that has a heavy plot, when you read a piece of contemporary literary fiction and you get to the last page, the first thing you're going to think is, well, what about X, Y, and Z? Major items in the book that are not concluded in any way, not addressed in any way, and you seem to have forgotten them. What about the book? What about what passed for the story that you were at least attempting to tell? Here you're just ending. You're just getting up from the table. That is, metaphorically speaking, exactly what happens. The authors just stop. They don't have any idea what an ending implies, and they also know that they're beyond criticism. If you criticize them, you're a racist, you're a sexist, you're a bigot, you're a xenophobe. If you criticize them, then you're stepping outside of the snobbery circles of Williamsburg and are fair game for any kind of gross personal insult, including the favorite gross personal insult of adherents of a contemporary literary fiction, which is that you just don't understand reading. You just don't understand the fiction that you're reading. That is the go-to insult for these people, and they are perfectly free to say it even to, let's say hypothetically, someone who's been reading contemporary fiction with a great deal of attention and care for far longer than their parents have been alive. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. They do it absolutely without shame. They'll just turn blandly to someone 3 times their age and say, oh, you just don't, the only reason that you think that this ends poorly is because you just don't understand it. Not just this book, but everything you read. You just don't understand it that well. And all the paying editors who thought otherwise and been willing to commission you to prove it, they didn't know what they were talking about. They probably don't understand either. No. We, the select from, Williamsburg, preferably in one block of Williamsburg, preferably less than a quarter mile away from the nearest vinyl store, and if you're also a quarter mile away from the nearest suspender store or vendor of mustache wax, so much the better. No, we understand, but you don't. I don't care how many authors you knew personally. I don't care how many novels you've written. I don't care how many novels you reviewed. You still don't understand. But to answer the question, brilliant character study. A character came to mind. The character of Yejide from Ayobami Adebayo's Stay With Me. In that novel, she is a character who is faced with the horrible decision. She's caught between 2 forces. She wants to get pregnant with her husband, and she hasn't yet. And their culture, Nigerian culture, their parents are from an older version of their homeworld culture, and their parents just assume, well, if wife number 1 isn't getting pregnant, then what we need here is wife number 2. And it puts Yejide in a bind of a position, something that could elicit what the question asks for, a brilliant character study. The only reason it does not is because the author has never read anything but contemporary fiction. And I would be willing to bet never anything but exact contemporary fiction. Contemporary fiction written by people roughly the author's own age. So never anything else. Never any Chekhov, never Turgenev, never Tanizaki, never Wharton or Farrell or anybody like that. Never, not even the thought of doing that, and never will. So in other words, when you read a writer's advice, everybody from Stephen King to Neil Gaiman to you name it, you ask a writer, a prolific genre, successful writer, what's the number one thing you can do to improve your writing? They will all, universally, no matter how much garbage I think the rest of their instructions may be, they will universally say the number one thing you do to improve your writing is read, and read widely. Read voraciously all the time. And the authors that we're talking about here do less of that than any other author anywhere in the entire Republic of Letters. And I don't just mean fiction. The author of, the latest of My Reflections on the Game of Baseball, that author reads more of the literary antecedents of contemporary fiction than the writers of contemporary fiction do. They are completely childlike innocent of their own literary tradition. So, and as a result of that, Yejide in this book could have been a brilliant character study, but she isn't. She trembles on the verge of getting 2 or 3 dimensions, a little color, and then fades away into bad dialogue and even worse pacing. So let's just move on to the next question. Question number 3. Name an LFN that has experimental or unique writing. There's no such thing as unique writing. Experimental writing, we can kind of sort of do something like The Wake by Paul Kingsnorth. But the book I had in mind isn't out yet in America. It's out in the UK, and it's going to get talked about a bit, I would think. It's Ducks Newburyport by Lucy Ellmann. And it's the experimental part is that it's not particularly structured, which is a bugaboo that I'm talking about here for contemporary literary fiction. But at least the framework of this book is designed so that the lack of structure is believable, so that the thoughts pinballing from one subject to the next and back again, the setup of the book is such that is believable, that you would read that and think, okay, well, this shouldn't have any structure. If it's just someone's thoughts from subject to subject to subject, then maybe it shouldn't. It wears a little thin. The experimental part is very good, but the book is way too long. But at least I can call that legitimately experimental, and it is in large chunks readable. Then question number 4: name an LFN with an interesting structure. And I can kind of sort of do that. For instance, There by Tommy Orange, his hideously overpraised debut novel, which has this sort of Decameronish structure, where there is an American Indian event, a big American Indian event, and a whole group of people are traveling. They're making circuitous routes to that event. It is the plot point of all their different stories. And we get each of their different stories, and of course, in the course of the book, their different stories turn out to be connected in ways, and some ways overt, some ways far more in the background, all sort of spiraling into that one center event. And that structure is interesting. It fails. It fails completely. The author completely fails to invest any of those individual people with individuality, so that each one of them reads like a sliver of the author's own personality. There are damning echoes of phrases and vocabulary that I'm sure if the author caught them, if he has anybody in his circle who's not a sycophant, who actually pointed out, there's a phrase or there's a word choice here that's very, very indicative, and it's in this person's story, but it's also in this person's story, and they're not anything alike. I'm sure if that was pointed out to the author, he'd say, yeah, I'm playing a deep game, 4th dimensional chess, but really it's just unconvincing. And it happens a lot. It happens way too often. It's a debut novel, so I'm willing to forgive it a lot, but that is still a defect. And according to everybody who has ever read this book or ever written anything about it, there aren't any defects in it whatsoever, or any defects even in its author. If Sally Rooney has had the Republic of Ireland named after her, so it is now the Republic of Sally Rooney, well, then Tommy Orange has a fully functional appendix. His body can metabolize vitamin C. He never lost his baby teeth. He is an absolutely perfect individual. Everything about not just his book, but him himself is biologically, eternally perfect. I don't talk about bandwagons. I don't have any idea where it comes from. Except that the defects of there would be the first thing that every one of those same critics would have talked about if Tommy Orange had been a cis white man. So, and since I know for sure that that is true, because I have seen critical reaction to books with this same structure that were written by cis white men, since I know for sure that that is true, the source of this book's renown is at least in large part disconnected from any kind of literary worth. And that ought to give people pause, but people don't know that because reading book reviews, reading criticism of earlier works, or, God forbid, reading earlier works set with the same kind of multi-voice structure with a central thought in the middle would be to stray outside of the incredibly narrow ambit of literary fiction. If you're a devotee of literary fiction, you will not know what Anthony Burgess wrote in 1970. You won't know what anybody did. That won't. No. Who wants to read anything like that? Something patriarchy. The result being that you are not only the most cloistered kind of reader anywhere in the world, but staggeringly ignorant. So you can look at something, a new book that makes jokes about the workplace, or that has an unreliable narrator, and you can just go on YouTube or in your book blog and wax rhapsodic about how incredible it is. And readers who aren't as narrow as you are, readers who are perhaps older than you are, the ones you disparage, will be looking at the same book and saying, well, okay, the only reason you would wax rhapsodic about this book is you're unaware of the things that it's directly parroting. And it turns out you are. That's why you're looking at literary gimmick X, Y, or Z in the latest hot topic piece of literary fiction and saying, this is just incredible, unique, unprecedented. When an older reader, for instance, dig up Anthony Burgess and ask him yourself, would say, okay, a dozen examples of that come to mind. And let's just analyze how good this book does at that. You're not expecting the book to be unique, but you're certainly not calling it unprecedented. Anyway, let's just move on. Number 5, we're only at 5. Name an LFN that explores social issues. And the one that came to mind, the Nigerian novel that came to mind for this one is Half of a Yellow Sun by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And it's about the Biafra, the lead up to the Biafra War of the 1960s in Africa, and the attempt to start a new nation. That those of us who have read, older authors, older African authors, know all about it. There's some great works of literature that came out of that same subject. And this book deals with that, but it deals with it very ineptly because this author does not know that literary tradition. Obviously does not know that literary tradition. So Half of a Yellow Sun is thin. It lacks oomph. It doesn't hit you at all, and it should. It absolutely should. And the only reason it doesn't is because the author's first draft got published. Because the author is Nigerian. Probably parents were involved in the Biafra War, and is therefore untouchable critically. No writing workshop can say anything negative about this manuscript when it's brought out piecemeal, chapter by chapter, in front of the workshop. What can they say? What can a corn-fed white son of Illinois farmers say about this when it comes before him in the workshop, anywhere in Illinois or Iowa or wherever? Suppose that cis white male son of white Ohio farmers reads the latest in-process chapter of Half of the Yellow Sun and says, well, okay, part of this was interesting, but here you're not explaining anything, and here you're assuming your reader knows something that I don't know. I don't know anything about this culture. And it's kind of your job as the author to explain that and to maybe make your characters live it so that it doesn't look like an exposition dump. And before you can get halfway through that, the teacher, not the author, but the teacher of the workshop is calling you a racist and demanding to the chairman that you be expelled from the workshop and from the school. If that's the kind of critical world that your book grows up in, then of course when it gets to a publisher, it's going to be the same way, only much more so, because you're going to have a fully formed social media following. By the time it gets to a reader in the public, in the marketplace, in a bookstore, Of course it's going to have rickets in all of its bones. Of course it is. It's going to stand sideways. It's going to have its defects prominently on display because they have been proudly championed by people for woke points. This is an unworked novel, one of many in modern contemporary literary fiction where, for one reason or another, usually the size of a social media following, the book has just been a protected hothouse flower from the very beginning of its inception to the end. No one has ever given it a critical working over, and as a result, when I get to it, knowing nothing of its genesis, the thing that strikes me the most is how poor it is, how weak it is, how you've got this character in chapter 2, she gets an enormous build-up, all the other characters talk about how important she is. In chapter 5, she disappears, there are 12 more chapters, she never reappears, and no one ever talks about her again. That is a first draft mistake. That's the whole point of something like that, is that your readers, your editors, everybody is supposed to catch that and make you change it. Because it is bad. Because it is bad. That is inept storytelling. But if we're describing literary fiction from the get-go as something that's less concerned with plot, then you're already writing a blank check for authors to just be bad and get an excuse for it. You don't think I'm writing genre fiction, do you? Yes, she disappears without another thought, but it was all part of my plan. Anyway, let's just move on. Question number 6. Name an LFN that explores the human condition. That's a very vague term. Any novel could be called a novel that explores the human condition. The one that I had in mind, that came to mind this time, was by Abu Bakr Adam Ibrahim, and it's Season of Crimson Blossoms. And it explores the social condition, but again, if I took the author's name off it and wiped the slate clean on social media and put John Irving's name on this book and gave it to you, and you are a reader of contemporary fiction and therefore a reader of nothing else, so your own rickets are showing as well. You don't ever swim in anything but the kiddie level of the pool, and you only read this thing at all. If I were to, not John Irving actually, because he's too old. But if I were to say, give you Season of Crimson Blossoms, and say it was written by Maximilian Hofstadter, and I gave you his author biography, and he grew up in Pennsylvania, and he's white as the driven snow, and he married his childhood sweetheart girlfriend. If you knew all that about, in other words, he checks none of the boxes of the progressive stack, you don't get any woke points for liking him at all, and I just gave you the book, you'd savage it. This same book, Season of Crimson Blossoms, you would savage. You would say, characters wander in and out, they're barely described, they don't have any interaction with each other, they don't talk like real people, and the main and secondary plot lines, if not plot, are just abandoned, they just float off into the sky. So Maximilian really could learn something from his less advantaged brethren. This is clearly white privilege, writing this book and expecting to get genuflection for it. If I gave you this same book with Maximilian's name on it, that is what your reaction would be if you were a diehard reader of contemporary literary fiction, which shows that reaction is completely fraudulent, because it's the exact same book. Let's press on. Question number 7. Name a brilliant literary hybrid genre novel. It's been fun watching these straining attempts by the people who've answered this to come up with an answer. I don't know what that means. I am going to assume my answer is going to be literary pastiche fiction. Literary pastiche fiction usually has to have a little bit more of a plot because it's inheriting its plot from what it's pastiching. So the example I had in mind was Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James, who is a diehard genre writer. She wrote murder mysteries. Really, really good murder mysteries. Oh, are they the best? Jeeves, get me a P.D. James. Preferably the best one. My time is so limited. She loved Jane Austen. She loved Jane Austen her whole life. And her whole life while she was writing murder mysteries that were paying the bills and setting up her descendants forever. She would constantly tell friends, what I'd really like to do someday is write a Jane Austen pastiche novel, except it would make me feel like a village curate. It would make me feel like every village curate who's ever lived. Every ineffectual writer always wants to sit down, in their writing parlor and write a Jane Austen pastiche novel. Wouldn't it be just not the thing at all? And a lot of her friends told her, let it be your last book. Wait. and do it as an afterthought. And see how deep you take it. See how much it involves you. And I don't know how much of that advice she took, but Death Comes to Pemberley is really, really good. It is a very, very good Jane Austen pastiche novel. But I don't know that you could call it, I think you could still call it literary. I don't know, though. I'm not 100% sure whether or not, those inhabitants of that tiny, cloistered little sliver of the literary world, the readers of only contemporary literary fiction, I'm not sure that they wouldn't just dismiss P.D. James as a genre writer. Maybe one of the better of the kind, maybe, an indoor genre writer, but still, dismissible. I'm not sure. They might do that. I find it hard to believe that in the course of a year they would read a novel that is more intelligent or better written than a lot of her so-called genre novels, but nevertheless, I wouldn't put it past the readers who only read literary fiction. So I'm going to say Death Comes to Pemberley. I could come up with a couple of other pastiche novels. Sarah Jeter Naslin's book, Sherlock in Love, for instance, is fantastic, just beautifully written, and a great Sherlock Holmes story. So I might put that as well, but we're going long, so I won't start listing alternatives. And then the final question number 8: which genre do you wish were mixed more often with literary fiction? And for me, the answer is automatic. Any of the more responsible genres. All of the other literary genres are more responsible than literary fiction. Literary fiction doesn't have to do anything, doesn't have to be anything. It is a protected hothouse flower class, and it has a built-in defense mechanisms from its adherents that if you point out its weaknesses, you don't understand it. And that is never said of any other kind of fiction. If you read a big science fiction epic and you point out, well, okay, parts of this were really good, but the aliens want to invade and kill everything, and their motivation for wanting to do that is never even stated, much less made believable. Other science fiction writers will say, yeah, I didn't notice that, but you're right. Or they'll say, no, I think the motive was made clear. Here, let's talk about it. I'm talking about this part of the book. I think that is the motive. Let's talk about whether or not that's convincing. No science fiction fan hearing you say that about that big science fiction book will say, I just don't think you understood it. That's all. Maybe you should move to Williamsburg. Maybe then you would understand it. So I would suggest importing responsible genres into literary fiction, something that doesn't disdain the word plot, something that values a heroic arc, an arc of redemption, something that values a well-structured, intentional ending that leaves you with a sense of climax and catharsis. These staples of the literary experience that were perfectly good for literature all the way from Homer and Hesiod up to the Beats, and that now seem to be passé and, how trite that you would even think of such things. No, they're not. They're still the essential of storytelling. And I would like it if maybe the worst examples of contemporary fiction would import more of those things to what they do. And they never will, because plot, consistent character development, a character arc that's shaded with nuance, and that has dramatic beats and a great dramatic ending, all of that stuff takes work. It takes a lot of work and multiple drafts. And if you are an absolutely hothouse flower, protected status author, turning out wee little thin, slim, prose poetry, pieces of contemporary literary fiction specifically for that tiny niche genre of Brooklyn readers, then the last thing you're going to do is work on your fiction. You are absolutely not ever going to write a second draft. Why would you? Writing a second draft would imply that there was something wrong with the first draft. And if you say there's something wrong with the first draft, you're a sexist, a bigot, a xenophobe. Anyway, that's what I would suggest. It's never going to happen. But every once in a while, somebody does it and gets the recognition they deserve. Less by Andrew Sean Greer. Won a major literary award. It is an extremely well-structured, accessible work of contemporary fiction. And even there, a perfect example. Look at the damning chorus of reactions from literary fiction, pinky in the air snobs. Look at the damning chorus of reactions that was given to that book when it won the prize by people who only read contemporary literary fiction. A little easy, isn't it? Has the prize really descended this low that we're giving it to a book like Less? Did you enjoy it? You found it enjoyable? As if enjoying a book is bad form. I loved watching the reactions that sparked all over the Republic of Letters, specifically in Brooklyn, by people saying, we're going to give it to Andrew Sean Greer. Why not give it to Nora Roberts? I loved it. Occasionally we get victories, but I don't even know if the we that I'm talking to is very widespread. So that, a bit contentiously, was the literary fiction tag. I feel like a weight has been lifted, but it was quite a bit of bile. I will mark the tag when I post it. I will mark it as rant heavy and full of bile, so that those of you who don't like that can just avoid it. And it ran long, because rants always do. But I'll wrap this up. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.